following Connecticut Experience presentation is part of the ongoing partnership between the Connecticut Humanities Council and Connecticut Public Television. Together, we're exploring Connecticut's rich history and culture.
Schools Good Enough for All is funded in part by the William Casper Graustein Memorial Fund. The Memorial Fund is working to improve education for Connecticut's children by supporting school change, informing the public debate on educational issues, and strengthening the environment of parents and the community in education.
Our children are our legacy. Few things are more important to us as parents and as citizens than preparing our children to become productive, successful members of society. For that reason, schools have always carried an enormous responsibility in Connecticut. We expect schools to teach our children occupational skills, provide knowledge for a meaningful life, and ensure they become responsible members of society. But because they are so important, Connecticut schools have always been controversial, a source of tension between different religious, political, and ethnic groups, between big cities and small towns, and between local communities and the state. For 350 years, Connecticut citizens have argued over many of the same questions we debate today. Who should have authority over the schools? How and how much should we pay for education? How should educational resources be distributed? Indeed, the educational debates in Connecticut's past may help us see some of today's controversies in a new and clearer light. When Puritan settlers moved into Connecticut 3.5 centuries ago, immediately they engaged teachers to start educating their children.
There were no formal schools. You would just go into a master's house, and the master would teach you.
Colonial Connecticut placed an extraordinary emphasis on education. A colonial law made clear the compelling purpose of early Connecticut schooling to ensure that Connecticut children took their place in a Bible commonwealth.
It being one chief project of that old eluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures, it is therefore ordered that every township of 50 households shall appoint one within their town to teach children to write and read.
Education reflected colonial society. In an agricultural economy, most schools were open only in winter, so children could work on the farms during the summer. And education reinforced the different roles of men and women. A court ordered in 1656,
"The sons shall have learning to write plainly and read distinctly in the Bible, and the daughters to read and sew sufficiently for the making of their ordinary linen."
The fundamental responsibility for education rested with parents. If local justice of peace discovered that you had a 9-year-old apprentice, 12-year-old apprentice who was illiterate, the master would be fined, or the parents would be fined. And in fact, children could be taken away from their parents if the parents did not see that they were being educated at least to the level of being able to read and write and learn an occupation.
And for a time, the system worked splendidly. According to a historian in the early 17th century, Connecticut was the most literate place on earth. From the very start, schooling was controlled by the colony and delegated to the towns.
This matter of local control is just so badly and fundamentally misunderstood by people in Connecticut. Towns in Connecticut are mere administrative units created for the convenience of the state. The state can abolish them, the state can divide them, and the state has divided towns over 100 times. The state can create new towns. The state can make the towns do anything they want. And this is certainly true in education.
There were schools, and they were mandated by first the colonial government and then the state government. But all that said was a town must provide schooling for its children. Didn't say how, didn't say anything.
From the beginning, the question of who paid for education was a contentious one. In colonial Connecticut, towns were required to support teachers, a responsibility that was transferred to ecclesiastical or parish societies in 1712. Societies were divided into smaller districts responsible for financing the schools. Shortfalls were made up by billing parents based on student attendance. The system was not always equitable and soon broke down.
The first time they take a survey of the state, nobody can read or write, the schools are not doing their jobs, teachers are unqualified, there's shortages of books, the one-room schoolhouse it really is just beginning, it's just a whole mess of problems. So the state of Connecticut simply threw it back to the towns and then to the parishes or to the ecclesiastical societies for the ministers, mostly congregational, to try to reform education.
In the wake of the American Revolution, Connecticut sold off a huge area it owned in what is now northeastern Ohio and dedicated the funds to education.
The interest would go for all the towns in Connecticut. But what do all the towns in Connecticut do is once they get their share of the state free money, they cut back their own expenditures, and so education for the next 50, 60 years again is going nowhere. So there's a frugality to education. Everyone wants to have the kids educated. Nobody wants to pay for it.
The one-room schoolhouse, long a part of American folklore, was the primary method of teaching in Connecticut. In practice, it left a good deal to be desired.
The road is higher than the house, and so fixed that when it rains, it washes the mud and filth before the door. The clapboards hang loosely, and when the wind blows, they clatter as if they were trying to see which would clatter the loudest. The plastering is sadly torn off, the roof so open and leaky that when it rains, it is almost as difficult to find a dry place as it was for Noah's dove.
The methods of teaching were also far from ideal.
4-year-old kids went to school. They sat on benches without backs. Their feet didn't reach the ground. They had a little book, or in the earlier period, a little piece of board or horn from a cattle-type animal, and on which was carved or inked in the alphabet. And each letter had a saying after it. A was in Adam's fall we sinned all. And you sat there and you looked at this thing for an hour and a half, 2 hours. In Adam's fall we sinned all, and then B, whatever it was. And the teacher called you up to usually his desk and pointed to these letters, and you'd say B. You'd say, okay. You'd say R. You'd say, okay. You'd say M. You'd say, okay, go sit down. And then you sat down for another 2 hours and looked at this thing. It was just awful.
Children of color were either out of school or faced with discrimination in school.
There were 1 or 2 Negro boys who attended schools and sat apart from the other scholars in the southeast corner of the house.
Parents were charged for school costs on the basis of their children's school attendance, so poorer families had an incentive to keep their children out of school.
I well remember, while Committee of the North District, making out year after year the rate bills under which the parents, usually the poorer ones, paid a large part of the school expenses. The plan was oppressive and unwise.
More affluent residents began sending their children to private academies that began to spring up in many Connecticut towns. A state survey in 1837 discovered that more money was spent on the state's 10,000 private school students than on its more than 60,000 public school students. In the 1830s, a movement developed to reform Connecticut's educational system. The undisputed leader of Connecticut's movement for educational reform was Henry Barnard.
What Barnard did was himself to visit the schools, to compile data on the schools, to publish reports on the schools, to agitate for public support for the schools.
And he finds for the first time this tremendous parental apathy. Parents don't care. Textbooks are substandard. The buildings are substandard. We need better one-room schoolhouses. He calls for teacher training, We have to have qualified teachers who know how to teach to be in the classrooms. We have to raise teachers' salaries for the first time. We have to make education a priority.
So his first and foremost objective was to have all children in school, not only for the educational or the schooling purposes of learning to read and write and figure and so on, but for the moral and political purpose of democracy.
Barnard developed a comprehensive program to improve education, which shaped much of the state's educational policy down to the present day.
It's hard to think of an aspect of schooling which Barnard does not have his hand in 19th century Connecticut.
He publishes articles on the use of the blackboard. We tend to think that computers are the great advance. They are, but blackboards in 1840 were a great advance, a technological advance.
Barnard aimed to elevate the profession of teaching.
When he arrived on the scene, typically teachers worked for only short terms, 8 or 10-week terms. In any case, because teachers worked so few weeks in the year, they had to have other sources of livelihood so that they couldn't be specialists in teaching. Usually teachers didn't last in a given school for more than a year or two. There was tremendous turnover.
Often, the principal requirement for getting a job teaching school was you have to be big enough to beat up the biggest kid in class. I actually found a case where a man was hired to teach school 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month or so after he was hired and had been conducting school. It was discovered that he was illiterate.
The Hartford Courant once reported,
A master's beating had caused the death of a pupil in Windsor. The teacher insisted that the child had been recalcitrant, that his switch was only 13 inches long and no thicker than the stale of a pipe at the biggest end, and that the child received few blows and no marks on the skin.
Central to Barnard's program was teacher training.
Later in his career, he becomes the first head of what was then called the New Britain Normal School. It's now Central Connecticut State University, which is the first teacher training institution in the state.
Teacher training for women became the crusade of another Connecticut educator, Catherine Beecher.
She started something called the Hartford Female Seminary. There was no college, there was nothing equivalent to Yale for girls. And in many ways, the Hartford Female Seminary was comparable to the schooling that boys were getting at Yale.
While both the colony and the state of Connecticut had mandated education, it was Henry Barnard who first began to put state responsibility for education into practice.
He's more responsible than anyone else for asserting the right and, in fact, the responsibility of the state to look out for public education. That was new. Previously, schooling had been left entirely to localities, to districts and towns. He feels that state authority is going to be necessary for both improving the schools and also for standardizing the schools, for making sure that a higher and more uniform quality of schooling is provided for the children of Connecticut.
But Barnard's reform was controversial to those who saw a state role in education as encroachment on simple government and local control. An editorial in the Hartford Weekly Times called it
a reform that takes power from the people and confers it on a few individuals, a reform which renders the system more complicated and difficult and which increases the offices and expenses.
And what happens? The state of Connecticut in 1839 passes a law saying, yes, we're going to start implementing some of these ideas. And within 4 years, because the Whig Party, which Barnard was associated with, was out of power, the Democrats come back and they cut the spending on that.
In 1842, the General Assembly repealed Barnard's education bill and he left Connecticut. But a decade later, the state recanted. It established a new state normal school for teacher training, and in 1851 recalled Barnard to serve as superintendent of schools. By the Civil War, Connecticut was moving toward Barnard's ideal of schools good enough for all.
His favorite saying was that common schools should be common because they were cheap enough for the poor and good enough for the rich.
During the late 19th century, Connecticut went through enormous changes as the Industrial Revolution took hold in New England.
So large factories grew. The inventiveness of Connecticut entrepreneurs came up with new machines and new productive techniques, and they needed a labor supply. And people moved from these small towns to the cities. It's a phenomenon we don't think about, but for years and years, the small towns in Connecticut lost population. People came to Hartford, and they went to New Britain, and they went to Bridgeport.
This change had a great impact on Connecticut education.
Right from the beginning, the local communities were responsible for the maintenance of schools, for implementing school policy. It meant a burden for cities because they had suddenly people that spoke different languages, that had different customs, that didn't know anything about the American traditions. So it's a challenge to somehow Americanize them.
New Haven's superintendent of schools complained that the city's population was increasing and promiscuous, containing a large foreign element.
An influx of people who were ignorant of our institutions, laws, language. People who had not been accustomed to send their children to school in the country from whence they came, and who seemed to care but little for their education, especially in the English language.
Connecticut cities, with their growing wealth, responded to the challenge.
And of course, cities now do have the money to build schools. So urban schools during this period became very important institutions, and ones that cities were willing to invest a good deal of money to support.
New Haven was a pioneer in adapting to the new urban industrial society. In 1850, its common schools were much like those that Barnard had criticized a quarter century before. Indeed, their quality was so poor that more than half of the city's children were sent to private and parochial schools. But that was soon to change. In 1852, New Haven school officials established a revolutionary citywide system of graded public schools and abandoned the one-room schoolhouse concept forever. Their goal was to attract middle-class parents to send their children to the public schools, thereby establishing broad-based support for a publicly financed school system.
The children of the rich and poor will occupy contiguous desks to the common benefit of both classes and of society at large.
When New Haven's Webster School was divided into grades, Henry Barnard exulted.
Parents who had before thought the public schools unfit for their children are now hastening to withdraw their children from the private schools and place them in the people's school, the common school.
What happens is that there's suddenly a rush into public schools. There's a waiting list to get into the school. And as it's graded, that list grows and grows. And then by the end of the 19th century, New Haven is thought to have one of the best public school systems in the country. Hillhouse High School in New Haven is thought of as one of the top 3 public high schools in the United States. And this remains true until after World War II. It has a fine reputation, and it gets its students into the most elite colleges in the nation as a result.
By the early 20th century, Connecticut's urban schools were often far superior to those of its rural small towns.
We think of it the opposite way today, maybe, but certainly in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, the urban high school was a major and efficient institution for educating everybody.
Rural areas envied the excellence of the urban schools. This cartoon from 1897 shows a small-town boy peering enviously at a student graduating from Hartford High School. A 1909 state report observed,
Very grave injustice is being done today to a large proportion of the children of the state through the inequalities of school opportunity resulting from this system of local management. Partly, this injustice is due to the different ability of different communities to maintain suitable schools.
In 1923, the state first addressed the division of rich and poor towns by establishing hardship grants with low per pupil wealth. After World War II, Connecticut's suburban population grew enormously. Cities, which had been the engine of the state's economy, were increasingly abandoned by industry. Poor people, especially members of discriminated against racial and ethnic minorities, were concentrated in urban areas.
What happened after World War II was that a lot of factors come together, but certainly transportation technology was one. The automobile had gotten to the point where it was affordable for almost everybody. The road system had developed to the point where it was easy to get out.
During the 1950s, New Haven's population dropped 7.5%, while that of Orange increased 182%. Hartford suffered a net loss of 9% in the 1950s, and 6,500 young married couples left the city.
The open fields of the south end of East Hartford, spreading toward Glastonbury and eastward to Manchester, became the site of countless single-family private housing developments.
And the government helped people move to the suburbs. You could get your FHA GI mortgage, nothing down, low interest. The government is almost saying to you, we want you to have a home of your own, and the place where we want you to have it is in the suburbs.
The burden of providing schools for the burgeoning suburbs was immense.
This rush to the suburbs put a tremendous stress on the schools in what were formerly small towns. They had to build schools in a hurry.
But it was an era of broad public support for education.
I think of the 1950s as the golden age of 20th century education in Connecticut. It was the era of the baby boom. Broad support for education, huge building programs, funds being turned into education.
Federal support for education expanded enormously as the Cold War and the space race redefined education as a matter of national security.
Sputnik galvanized the whole nation. Federal funds were poured into science education, but ultimately there was a spin-off effect, and all of education benefited from that.
The state's aid formulas also provided a big subsidy for the growing suburban school systems. The state paid less than 11% of Hartford's school expenses in the early 1950s, but more than 18% of those in East Hartford, Glastonbury, and Windsor. But while suburbs burgeoned, jobs and economic activity began to leave Connecticut's cities.
The economy of the state changes. Factories are relocating outside of Connecticut. The cities now are in the reverse trend, whereas they're declining in population now.
The effect in the mid-70s, for example, was that someone could move across the town line from Hartford to Bloomfield, reduce their tax burden by 50%, and improve the amount of money that their child was receiving in educational resources in the schools.
So here are cities now who have less money because of jobs that have departed. They have a population that's not wealthy enough to leave, that have lots of needs, including education, and they have less money to provide it. And they don't have the political power, which is interesting too, because at one point, Connecticut's legislature was dominated by the small rural towns. Even when the cities had wealth, they didn't have much power in the legislature. Now, after World War II, more and more, and certainly it's true by 1970, that the legislature is dominated by suburban towns, and the city gets less and less help from the state.
Meanwhile, a growing number of African Americans began migrating to Connecticut, and they were overwhelmingly concentrated in the state's major cities.
The African Americans are not able to move. There's a lot of discrimination. There are several major articles in Hartford papers, for example, in the 1950s. One series I remember reading, and the title of it is, "Where Can a Negro Live?"
Large portions, if not all, of the newly developed suburban tracts are closed to Negroes. He cannot conform to America's mania for a private home. He has not attended the equal opportunity to buy or rent a house that his fellow middle-class American has in Hartford's White Ark.
There was a time when there were a number of us who were helping African American families buy houses in the suburbs by buying them as straws, whites going out to buy such housing and then turning them over to African American families. That's what you had to do to get somebody into the suburbs in the early 1960s in Hartford or anywhere in Connecticut. That's the context in which people were left trapped in the city.
Connecticut's changing economy and demography soon affected education. The concentration of African Americans and increasingly of Latinos and other racial minorities in inner cities, combined with the state's pattern of town-based school districts, led to widespread racial isolation in Connecticut schools.
As the middle class moved across the borders into the suburbs for a variety of reasons, both racial and financial, the families left behind had greater needs. Students were less equipped or less inspired by their own parents. The costs of providing equal services and getting equal results for that population are simply greater, but because the middle class had moved to the suburbs and taken their property tax wealth with them, the money wasn't there to do that.
As Connecticut became more starkly two Connecticut's, the state's long struggle with educational equity intensified.
Towns vary in their ability to finance education at a ratio of maybe 40-to-1, based on the definitions we currently use in our state funding formula. Greenwich has 40 times as much wealth as Bridgeport behind each student to finance education. And that results in per pupil expenditures that are twice as high in some towns as they are in other towns, tax rates that are much higher in the poor communities than they are in the wealthy communities.
The Horton versus Meskel case challenged this inequality. The Connecticut Superior Court ruled that this system of school finance violated the equal protection and education clauses of the state constitution. The judge referred to the sheer irrationality of a system that allocates educational resources on the basis of property values. The state legislature eventually agreed to expand state education funding to 50% of cost and established an equalized cost-sharing formula so that more funds would go to educate children in towns with a low per capita property tax base. But many Connecticut towns are now in court charging that the state is violating its own policy by capping the state's contribution toward education costs.
When the cap was put on that 4 or 5 years ago, no town in Connecticut has been impacted negatively more than East Hartford by that. In fact, we would have been shortchanged about $9 million this year by the cap. Our legislators were able to retrieve about $2 million more, so we're still being shortchanged $7 million, which is really desperately needed to maintain this as a quality school district.
As Connecticut cities became predominantly poor and black, the issue of rich and poor towns merged with the issue of racial equality. In 1965, at the height of the civil rights movement, a team from Harvard University issued a report called Schools for Hartford.
That Harvard group recommended that the concentrations of poverty within the city of Hartford within the schools in Hartford be dispersed, both by moving students within the city of Hartford and by sending students out to the suburbs. A year later, the state instituted Project Concern in 1966, which was a voluntary program that allowed students from Hartford and at that time Bridgeport and New Haven to go out to the suburbs.
Despite such programs, Connecticut's school system became increasingly segregated, leading to the well-known Sheff versus O'Neill lawsuit.
And throughout the 80s, various commissioners of education and the State Board of Education studied the increasing racial and ethnic isolation that was producing poor educational opportunities in largely the three major cities of New Haven, Bridgeport, and Hartford. That culminated in 1989 with a report by then Commissioner Gerald Tarazi that Connecticut maintained two separate school systems. One was non-white and urban and poor and below the state standards. And the other was suburban, predominantly white and predominantly affluent and exceeding the state standards. He concluded that this two Connecticut school systems was immoral, illegal, and educationally unsound, quote unquote. The Sheff versus O'Neill suit was filed right after the release of that report in 1989.
In 1996, the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools violated the state constitution and that the state must do more to change the status quo.
In the late 80s, the state began to fund magnet schools, and it began to fund interdistrict cooperative programs, which are after-school, summer, and weekend programs that are designed, at least in part, to reduce racial isolation. And those programs have been growing over time.
The Sheff plaintiffs supported the state's programs to stimulate voluntary integration and called for them to go even further.
The simple truth of the matter in the history of the United States with respect to race, class, and education is that the privileged does not want to relinquish to the disfavored group. Therefore, if you lived in Westport or Weston or Darien, you probably wouldn't want to send your children to Norwalk, unless Norwalk was reconfigured to offer the advantages of education that makes children come to Yale University, located in a disadvantaged community. I would make certain educational facilities in the large urban centers temples of learning to attract students.
The Sheff case raised the highly controversial question of whether the state school districts should continue to be based on town boundaries or whether school systems should become regional.
The number one cause of the racial and ethnic segregation in the city school systems is the fixed boundary line that makes the school district the same boundary as the municipal district. That freezes in the changes in the transformation of the social and economic and racial and ethnic makeup of the cities and confines the segregation largely within. Therefore, the solution is to eliminate, to drop the boundary line, to provide for a transfer of student assignments across boundary lines to achieve both equal education in the region as well as more racial and ethnic integration.
The Sheff plaintiffs also called for mandatory programs to reduce racial isolation, but such mandatory approaches have been highly controversial.
But is it possible to have a quality school that's not 47.2% black and 38.5% white and 12% Hispanic? Well, of course you can. And it's ridiculous and it's insulting. And to my mind, it's racist to suggest that it's impossible for a black child to learn unless he's plopped down next to a white student. But until we get over that hurdle, the tragedy is this battle over integration distracts you from the real problem. And that's too many schools aren't teaching their children anything. And there are ways to do something about that without fighting what could be another 10 or 20 or 30-year battle over how many brown and black faces we need to have in every classroom.
I don't think making mandatory changes is ever something that's certainly going to go over easily. There better be a real good reason and a real good balance on both parts, the people that are coming in as well as the people that are going out. And as always, the parents have to be the biggest voice in all this because it's their children.
It scares you. Every time your kids walk out of the house, you have a sense of fear that something will happen before they return. But to have them go where there is violence that you hear about on a daily basis, that really scares me. And I feel sorry for the children that are going there, that they do not have the advantage of coming to a country school or a small town school. But it's almost like I chose to live here, so they could choose to live where they wanted to. So it's very selfish on my part that I feel that way.
Reformers argue segregation itself is a symbol of inferiority and on that level must be challenged. But some question its relationship to learning.
If you're going to have integration, you have to have belonging. Belonging is probably the most important human need. And if you don't have belonging, then you're not going to perform adequately unless you're prepared for that, unless you're geared, unless parents and others prepare you to hold your own in a system that's rejecting you, then you're not going to perform at your best. we think in a very mechanical way, and so we think of community school, and we think of smaller classrooms, and that's good, but that's not sufficient. One of the problems for Connecticut and the country right now is that school reform has boiled down to raising test scores. Now we know that test scores don't predict life success, but everybody wants accountability, and they want quick accountability, and that's the only thing we have that's hard, so to speak. And so we're all focused in on raising those test scores in a way that in many cases actually interferes with providing children the kinds of experiences they need to grow and develop. Now, that will blow over, I hope. If it doesn't blow over, we're in deep trouble.
Students and parents have had limited say about the controversial relationship between towns and the state.
That's kind of unfair to us and the kids who have to come all the way out here and we have to go all the way over there.
If we have to take a bus all the way to Norwalk, see, I'm not a morning person, so I wouldn't be very happy to have to get up early just so the bus will be on time to get to Norwalk. I think that there should be another way, but I can't think of any other ways.
We've had a bit of a struggle in our history in terms of the state fulfilling its responsibilities in public education, and our courts have played a big role in that. We had the Horton versus Meskel decision, which was a critical funding decision 25 years ago, which really moved to the formula we have now, where the state is providing much more money to their urban, poorer communities than to the wealthy communities. And of course, we had our lawsuit in the Sheff versus O'Neill decision, where the courts have really forced the state to address issues of racial inequality and I think a comparative funding inequality that you still see. So we've come a little bit kicking and screaming, I think, in the sense that the state legislature and the executive branch have had to have court decisions in the last 30 years drive the increased involvement of the state and increased funding at the state level.
As in the past, much of the issue comes back to funding.
The funding problem in Connecticut is largely a factor of the necessity to finance schools locally. Connecticut for years provided less funds from the states proportionately than any other state does. It's improved its ranking in that regard. But it still depends upon local funding. I think this is the irony of this myth of local autonomy, town local autonomy, because what you really have on the towns is local responsibility for funding schools. The state mandates all kinds of things, but the state doesn't provide sufficient funds to carry these things out.
I think the state is recognizing more and more that it has a higher obligation. The property tax burden on local communities is so driven by the education costs at the local level that finally there is, I think, a consensus up here on a bipartisan basis that property tax reduction is a critical part of the state's response to municipalities. And that really means increasing education aid in a lot of ways.
But with increased state funding has come increased state control.
I think you're starting to see a little more emphasis on accountability at the state level. We used to just essentially provide a check to local towns based on our grant formula and say, here the money is, and you at the local level decide how to spend it. More and more we're saying, well, here's some more money, but you have to use it for reading instruction for first and second and third graders, and we expect you to show some results.
The issues of educational inequality in Connecticut remain unresolved.
I have hopes that we can do something in Connecticut on the issue of school desegregation that no other state has done, because we're the only state that's ever been sued, and we're the only state that's really working on a statewide solution, working on voluntary desegregation. We might be able to create some models for other states.
History will reflect that for all of the successes that Connecticut has enjoyed in education, and it's enjoyed many, it also had a very lingering and persistent problem with racial and ethnic segregation and unequal educational opportunities.
Even as Connecticut education struggled with the state's urban-suburban divisions, a new set of challenges was emerging.
There has been a tremendous migration of both blacks and Hispanics out of the central city and into the surrounding suburbs. Before 1990, with the exception of Bloomfield, which has always had a very high minority population, primarily black, most of the suburbs in Hartford had minority populations in single digits. At the current time, most of the first-ring suburbs around Hartford have integrated. So while there is still tremendous concern about the fact that 96% of the Hartford school population is minority, the surrounding suburbs have become the integrated units that was hoped for in the greater Hartford region.
The city of East Hartford probably has changed more dramatically than any town in Connecticut in the past 10 years. In the late 80s, our minority population was around 15%. It's now over 60%.
We have 40 different languages spoken in school. We have students who've originated from over 70 different countries. I think we're a model when you talk Sheffers O'Neill. We have a cultural mix that I think is probably not replicated at a lot of other places in this country. And we're showing people that it works, and it works well. I think my first challenge was to get people to understand what the expectations were. And that was not only students, but staff, and express my expectations to the community, that we were going to have a first-class educational system, and that anything less than that was inferior. So we focused a lot on discipline and ensuring that we had a safe learning environment. Then creating a first-class learning environment where we have challenging courses, and we expect all children to be challenged to the highest level of their ability.
East Hartford's transformation has significantly strained the community's resources.
Our budgets have really been inadequate for what we need to do during this period of time. More students coming in, close to 2,000 more, but the services that many of these students require have been extreme and have really stretched our budget to the limit. The grand list has, in the past few years, has either gone down or it's been relatively stable, but it hasn't grown with comparable towns, comparable sized towns. And meanwhile, the cost of education has gone up. So it's been a strain on the taxpayers and the homeowners of East Hartford to budget the school district.
What are the implications for the future?
I would say what we've seen in East Hartford and what we've seen, the changes of East Hartford, it will be a predictor of what's happening in most towns in Connecticut in the past 20 years. The influx of people from different backgrounds, the transiency that goes with it, the educational funding, but the ultimate product, these students actually working and learning and liking each other, I think those factors are things that everyone needs to study, because I think it's being done well here. And this will be the model. Whether people are ready for it now, this will be the model for the future for Connecticut.
As Connecticut schools enter the new millennium, they continue to face the same contentious questions that have troubled them for more than 350 years. What should be the balance between local and state authority? How do we provide the resources needed to educate our children? And how can education be provided fairly for all?
As you look back over the 3.5 centuries in Connecticut, I think you see this tension that is developed here between the state that always has had an interest in education. They, back in colonial times, said kids have to go to school. They've required that communities support schools. So there's that state interest that everybody be educated. This idea that the same opportunity ought to be available to everybody. And that's really on a collision course with the local feelings. All I'm responsible for are my schools, my area. And I think suburbanization has encouraged that. It's encouraged this privatism, this belief that, no, I'm not part of the state. I am part of Wilton, Weston, Ridgefield, wherever, all right? And that's where my responsibility ends. I don't know how many letters to the editor that I have read in papers over the years that say, why should I be concerned with the problems of Bridgeport? I live in Fairfield. I think somehow we've got to feel that we are all part of one state. And, you know, we can't be healthy as a state if part of the state doesn't have an opportunity to be educated.
I don't believe we can convince the average suburban voter that that's true, and therefore I don't think that we're going to get, as a political solution, any significant form of regionalization. The best we can do is to get some grudging regional resource sharing, funding, and even that's hard to do.
Well, I've often thought that anyone who says that money is not the answer is wrong, and anyone who says that money is the answer completely is wrong. Let's face it, we're some sort of a compromise in terms of how much tax money are we willing to pay to support people, to raise the next generation of young people and have them have the skills we need to have.
And the federal government has really all but abdicated its role in education funding. And I mean, it's a minimal percentage of the dollar that is spent. But I think the state is becoming more preeminent in funding and in driving educational priorities. And that's probably appropriate. We're closer to people than the federal government, and we have more capacity to raise revenue at the state level than local towns do with property tax. Because we're providing more resources, and because we still see test scores that aren't satisfactory, state's providing a little more strings to state aid than it used to 10 years ago. And I think that's a positive trend. I think it's something we have an obligation to do.
Let me tell you something else that I think the whole history of Connecticut education reveals, and that is that there can be excellent public education. Public education does not have to be the stepchild of the state or the stepchild of society or the community, but we have to pay attention to it. It doesn't come easy. It's expensive. We can afford it. The richest state in the nation can afford the best education in the nation.
The common school should no longer be regarded as common because it is cheap, inferior, and attended only by the poor and those who are indifferent to the education of their children, but common as the light and the air because its blessings are open to all and enjoyed by all. That day will come.
Thank you for watching Schools Good Enough for All, our show about the history of education in Connecticut. Stay tuned for a lively discussion on the future of schooling in our state. Many of the leaders and critics of the state's public school system will participate in our studio forum. If you have an interest in this topic, you don't want to miss it. It's coming up next.
Schools Good Enough for All is funded in part by the William Casper Graustein Memorial Fund. The Memorial Fund is working to improve education for Connecticut's children by supporting school change, informing the public debate on educational issues, and strengthening the environment of parents and the community in education.
Thank you for tuning in to Schools Good Enough for All, a very important documentary on education in Connecticut. Now, if you've been watching that program, you saw how the state's educational system evolved from the colonial period to today. Now, what is the current status of education, and where do we go from here to provide the best possible learning for our children? Those questions will be explored in the second part of our program on Connecticut education. I'm here with a distinguished panel and a studio audience well-versed on the issues of education. Representatives of all interested parties are present tonight, from students and parents to teachers, administrators, and lawmakers. On our panel tonight is the State Commissioner of Education, Ted Sergi. State Representative Cameron Staples, who is co-chair of the General Assembly's Education Committee. Martin Gross, the author of The Conspiracy of Ignorance, The Failure of American Public Schools. Rosa Quesada, Executive Director of Hartford's Public Schools. And Gordon Bruno of the Connecticut Center for School Change. Welcome to all of you in our studio as well as our home audience. I wanted to start with a short discussion about what we saw in the documentary about the history of education in our state. And Commissioner Sergi, as in every classroom, some student has to be the first one to get called on, and tonight you're it. Let me ask you, do you see one common thread or one common theme or perhaps one common element of tension that stretches back from the present day to the beginning of public education in Connecticut?
Well, I think so, Steve. I think if you look back in Connecticut's history, and I think the documentary talked a little bit about this, we really have had some form of public education in this state back into the 1700s. Noah Webster, right here in the greater Hartford area, followed probably 50 years later with Henry Barnard, talked about universal, free public education. And I think that's always represented the opportunity for everyone to participate. Thomas Jefferson and others talked about the common school as the bedrock of democracy, and without which you couldn't really have the kind of strength of a country we've had.
All right, let me ask you something.
So I would stay with the word opportunity, and the disagreements over the centuries have always been about how do you get the most opportunity given the resources you have, and how much resources do you need to reach everyone.
What about the tension that is there that I see from looking at in the documentary between local government and the state government almost from day one? Let me ask you, Mr. Gross, you're a critic of the way public schools are set up and how the system has evolved. What's your take on that?
Well, the state is sovereign and really is in charge of education of the children, although the federal government puts its unfortunate finger into the pie and destroys it. The state is not fulfilling its obligation, whether in Connecticut or Mississippi. And
has it ever fulfilled that obligation?
I would say that during the Depression years and into the 1940s, the public school system was the best in the world. And the reason is we had a large number of talented people who were very happy to work within the system. They did go to normal schools and undergraduate schools of education, which at that time was sufficient. The typical parent only had a 9th grade education. Only in 1940, only 1 in 4 Americans even graduated from high school. So that the teacher was in many ways superior to the population. Now we have a reverse situation where the typical educated parent in Connecticut has better academic credentials than our teachers, because the normal school system, which was sufficient for those days, is no longer sufficient. And I say in my book that the greatest single remedy for the unfortunate public school failure is to close all undergraduate schools of education, something that Europe did after World War II. So that to be a teacher in Germany, you must first be a graduate of a 4-year accredited college, and then in history, language, Latin or whatever, and then decide to become a teacher. In America, our children go from high school with poor high school grades into our undergraduate schools of ed, and then we expect them to create a good curriculum and good teaching. It's impossible.
All right, Mr. Edwards, you're a principal at East Hartford High School. That's a pretty stinging indictment Mr. Gross has handed out. Do you agree with that, or do you disagree? I think I know the answer, but you tell me.
Well, I disagree. I think that our colleges are doing a very good job, especially in Connecticut, educating and preparing teachers. The University of Connecticut now has a 5-year program, which I commend and applaud. That program has given an extra year and is producing much more qualified teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen, it might just be,
Sure, go
requires
ahead.
an undergraduate degree in the subject matter that Mr. Gross is proposing.
That's
So about 10 years
ago. That's a fake degree, because it's an undergraduate school of ed where they're really ed majors, and now through recent legislation they're supposed to have a major in biology, but they're taking 35 credits in education. They think they're learning how to teach, but the summa cum laude from Yale is not allowed to teach in my Greenwich High School because he has, quote, no education credit, so he goes to teach in Choate. I spoke to Choate. They have 107 faculty, and 3 are certified by the state of Connecticut. So if you're underqualified, you're certified, And if you're truly qualified, if you're a scholar, and I taught college for many years, and my colleagues were scholars, you can't teach in our public schools. It's an absolutely inverted situation.
Mr. Sergi, how important is certification in this whole process?
Certification should be...
I asked Mr. Sergi.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, we've seen some change in it, and maybe it would surprise Mr. Gross to know that I think the certification regulations, while he would like to abandon them all tomorrow, have been moving in the direction he was mentioning. We will now have full biology majors, not from the School of Education, but from the biology department at the University of Connecticut, teaching biology after a fifth year of a master's degree. And in fact, we're moving that way with middle school and high schools. We ask all our teachers coming in to take a test of reading, writing, and math, a test in their subject matter, and have their first few years observed. We've invested a lot on the front end of having the best possible teachers. I'm not sure if Mr. Gross would really disagree with that as being very important. There's nothing more important than the quality of people we put in front of our children.
Let me get off that point. Let me ask Cam Staples, Representative Staples, why is it that every time in the last 30 years or so that this state has made a major change in the way our education system runs, it always seems to be forced by a court ruling rather than by a conscious decision of the legislature?
Well, if you look at Connecticut's history and you look at the history of town rule in this state, there's always been a tension between local autonomy and the state of Connecticut having its authority over education. And I think it has taken the courts in our state to, in a funding case 25 years ago, and a desegregation case recently, and in a series of cases in between, it has taken the courts rather than the legislature, because quite frankly, the legislature represents all the communities in the state, and we have many communities that don't have severe needs, and we have a smaller number that do. And I think the majority of the legislature has just not been willing over the years, until the court cases, to step up to the plate and provide the funding that the smaller number of jurisdictions, our urban centers, need. So it has taken really an undemocratic court process to get us to the point where the funding is now largely going to the urban centers as opposed to the suburban communities.
Marcia Wellman, you're with the Conference of Connecticut Municipalities. That's a big title, but really it means that your organization represents cities and towns. You've heard some of these state officials talk about the state's point of view and their responsibility for education. Where do the towns stand right now?
Well, first of all, we have to say that last year in the session, the state made some really big gains in terms of new changes in education funding. But on the whole, still, Connecticut's property taxpayers are holding the bag, so to speak. We're still paying for property taxpayers are still paying for over 50% of the cost of local public education, and the tension's there. It's a burden that just can't be sustained. And we know the problems of the cap. We know the problems of, is the pie big enough? We know what needs to be done. We need to put the resources there.
When we say that it takes a court case to accomplish change, I think we need to expand on that a bit, because I think we delude ourselves in thinking that the court case has resolved these huge issues. There's another case following Horton Meskel, just on the aims of Horton Meskel some time ago for equality of financing. That's a case that hasn't been resolved yet. Insofar as the Chef O'Neill case requiring desegregation, it's a joke. We have this tension between local control and state responsibility, indeed a Supreme Court order to desegregate the schools, which the state continues to ignore, largely because it's treating the towns as if they were sovereign immunity, a concept with regard to compliance with a court case.
Mr. Bruno, as long as the camera is on you, let me ask you something, because I believe that you feel strongly about the concept of regionalism, that we should break away from the boundaries of each town doing its own school district and go to a more regional approach. Why?
Well, for a number of reasons, not the least of which is ultimately compliance with what the highest court in this land has told us we must do that we haven't done so far or think can be done voluntarily. Think of that. We have a court case requiring something, and by conscious state policy, the governor and the legislature said, well, it's okay as long as it's voluntary. Put that in perspective. I'm not altogether enchanted by regionalism as a concept, apart from the fact that it does seem to be ultimately a best solution from a variety of standpoints, not the least of which is to use resources well. We have 166 districts. Superintendent, average salary over $100,000. Most of these districts are 2,000 pupils or under. It is not an effective use of resources,
All right.
apart from the desegregation issue.
Let me ask, just a moment, let me ask Hyacinth Yenny, I know you were a neighborhood organizer, how would you feel if we moved from a system where each town has its own school system to one where it's more of a regional district? A positive step or not?
I think it will be positive in a lot of ways for the simple reason we'll get an equal share of what belongs to each district, and so we'll have a more, level balance of resource.
Now, you're from Hartford, right?
Yes.
Wouldn't it be likely that if we had a regional approach that kids from your city would have to be bused somewhere else? Would that be okay for most parents, do you think?
I like the fact that I can have a good education within the city that I live, and for going to another town to get a better education, I think it's fact that we should provide better education for our children here, so we don't have to be bused to another town.
All right, Iris, you're from
all about
Bridgeport, is that right? How do you feel about the same point?
I believe, like she believes, that we should keep our kids in our school district, and that we should have
in your city school districts.
In our city school districts, that we should have that quality education, and that our kids should not go anywhere else to get it.
How do you improve education, though? Do you just pump more money into the city schools?
Well, I agree with Mr. Sergi that teachers must be certified, that they must be good teachers. We cannot just have any person. And I think we usually tend to ask people to leave the careers that they have and become teachers. So that, in Spanish, we say, de doble filo, una cuchilla de doble filo. It has two sides to that. People who want to leave their careers and become good teachers, and some are out there that can become good teachers. But then I have another issue with certification and passing that test.
Let's not go back to that. Let me ask a student. We've been all adults talking here about how we should run the schools. Let me ask you, you've heard about, would you feel comfortable going, what school, you're with Weaver High?
Weaver High School,
And
yes.
that's in what city?
This is Hartford.
And what do you feel about the same point we just discussed here? Would you feel more comfortable if you knew there was a better school in the suburbs to attend, or would you prefer to stay at your school?
Well, quite frankly, I would prefer to stay at the school that I'm in. As far as the regional thing, on a regional perspective, I think that, yes, we can talk about moving to different regions in terms of where you get your education from, but there are bigger issues than that, and that is issues of racism and things like that. You can talk about desegregation, but at what price will we pay later by sending so many students outside of their own districts to somewhere that they have no experience, probably never been exposed to different people from different ethnic backgrounds since the time that they were brought into the education
Well, then how do you solve the problem? If you're comfortable at your own school, when I believe the Hartford school systems are, 90% or more minority students?
Correct.
And you say you would like to have a more balanced education in terms of exposure to other kids and have them be exposed to you. How do you do that if you don't move kids around?
Well, I think in terms of the question, I don't think we arrived at this situation overnight, and so the answer would probably not come overnight either. But in terms of how do we deal with the situation, I think it is, first of all, with installing within each and every student that there is a greater vision that you must focus on. And that vision, no matter where you be in Simsbury, Greenwich, Hartford Public High School, or for that matter, somewhere down in Canton, Connecticut, it does not matter where you are, just as long as you carry a vision that will take you to where you need to go, whether it be all the way over there in Avon, or whether it be right here in the city of Hartford.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Stringer, you're his principal. You're pretty proud of this young man for that kind of statement. How do you feel? Would you agree with him, or do you have a different take on it?
Well, I just wish you had put the microphone in front of me first, because I would have said the same thing. But I think it's a tough call. You want to make sure that your students are provided with the best education possible. As an educator, as a parent, I want to make sure that wherever I send my son or daughter is in the best school possible. It's an unfair choice that some of our students, parents, and educators have to face, but it's one that we have to come to grips with. If we're going to say that our schools are equal to all schools around, then we have to make sure that that is true. We can't just have lip service. If West Hartford has so much that their SAT scores are much higher than Hartford's or any other suburban school, then what do we need to make sure that those same opportunities come to our schools to enable us to increase those SAT scores or CAP scores? We have to level the playing field.
Let me add another point on that same issue, and let me ask Rosa on our panel. A few weeks ago, your superintendent rather, was cheering over the fact that Hartford, which has been looked at by so many people as the dregs, the bottom of public education in Connecticut. The state runs the school system right now. Mastery test scores came in, and lo and behold, Hartford wasn't at the bottom. There was a great celebration. And yet the next morning, I'm sure the superintendent picked up the paper and saw that he had some of his own colleagues in education criticizing him for that celebration, saying we didn't know it was all about a competition. It provides a stigma if we go that route. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think one of the things that Mr. Amato has said repeatedly is that the quality of the test that's given in Connecticut, the CMT, is a high-quality test. What we would expect for our students is what any suburban superintendent or any suburban staff would expect for their students, and that is for our students to become competitive with their peers, because those are the people that they're going to be competing with in the workforce as they leave us. So I think with respect to where Hartford intends to be, I think I agree with the ladies from Hartford and from Bridgeport. We hope that Hartford can be a place that has sufficient resources that will allow our students to get the best education they can, and that's what we're hoping to achieve.
I want to ask Larry Cohen, who's a newspaper columnist, who has a very different viewpoint on the whole issue of racial desegregation. You don't think it should be a main factor in how we run our schools?
No, to suggest that black children, Hispanic children can't learn unless they're sitting next to a white kid is insulting, it's offensive, and it isn't true. And in every other area of American life, you can shop where you want, you can drive where you want, you can eat where you want, but you can't go to school where you want. And if we really opened up that system and brought in a market economy and let these children go where they could find the best education, you'd have some natural integration and higher quality education to boot, I suspect.
Mr. Bruno, what do you think about that?
Well, I hear this a lot, and of course Larry and I have talked about this on panels before. It's a shop-worn cliche to continue to suggest, or the rhetorical question, can't students learn, or do they have to be sitting next to people of different races and cultures? That's not the point. Our Constitution says that every student in this state deserves a desegregated education. And we could talk about the many advantages. Students do contribute to the education of each other. And this indeed is a world that's composed of many, many cultures, different colors. And to assume also that the only way that we can learn together and bring down these walls that continue to divide us is to send kids out of Hartford is to look at the problem in the wrong way. There are many fine schools in Hartford. There's some of the finest teaching. I've seen it up close in classrooms in this city, and many students who are now in overrated suburban schools would do very well in some of these Hartford schools.
Mr. Gross?
The focus on minorities is important because they lag in performance, and yet the failure of the minority students is due entirely to the teaching corps, which is inadequate. Now, how do we know that? We know that because in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights, there's a school that's 90% African American, 10% Latino, and they were reading at less than 50% of the children were reading at grade level. And a new principal was brought in 5 years ago, Erwin Kurz, a graduate of Jewish parochial schools from kindergarten through university, who believes that educational theory, and I hate to use the word he says, is crap. And what he did was he put the kids in uniform, exercised great discipline, brought in phonics specialists, and after 4 years, the children are reading, the 83% of the children are reading at grade level, 20% higher than the city average and equal to any, quote, white, unquote, school. The problem is that teachers are not scholars. There's no emphasis on scholarship. The Pennsylvania study done last year by Secretary of Education Hickok in Pennsylvania showed that the average teacher had a C+ average at high school. He checked every teacher trainee in 91 colleges, and the average student had a B average.
All
So
right,
we've
Mr.
got,
Gross,
we've got a
let me-
situation that's
let me interrupt
reversed.
there, because I want to ask a couple of students here. You've heard what's just been said. You've heard this whole discussion. Do you feel that your teachers are qualified? Do you feel that you're getting inspiration from the teachers that you work with?
Yeah, I definitely feel that my teachers are qualified in what they teach. Each person is graduated university and graduate school in a specific subject area which he or she teaches. So there's no question in my mind about the qualifications or the knowledge of the
Well, then
people
what's
who
the
teach
problem?
me.
Why do there seem to be so much controversy about low test scores and all the debate about the quality of our public schools?
Well, I think that goes back to the idea of regionalism and the idea of the distribution of resources in Connecticut. Obviously, Hartford has a much lower per capita distribution of resources than other towns do, and I think that a lot of wealthier school districts might say it's not the money that's the problem, it's the teaching that's the problem, or it's the kids who don't want to learn that's the problem. But I think that I would say to those people, I go to Hartford High, and I would say to those people, if you don't think money is an issue, then let me go to your school with teal basketball courts and teak basketball wood courts and marble statues in the foyer behind a waterfall, and let me have access to some of the resources and the field trips and the extra activities that students at your school have access to.
Okay. Mr. Wall, you're a principal. What do you think's wrong?
Well, again,
if anything.
In listening to Gannon, it brings me a lot of pride to say that she is a student at Hartford Public High School. And with the recent occurrences that have taken place at Hartford Public High School with the threat of loss of accreditation, and again, it all comes right back to the lack of resources being pumped into the individual school. We've made tremendous strides in the last few years through a number of initiatives that we've taken on as a school, and coupled with the support that we've received from Superintendent Amato and Commissioner Sergi, we have made tremendous strides, and it all, in fact, comes right down to funding and also the resources there to assist us in our efforts.
Thank you.
Steve, I wonder if I could just jump in and say, if you still think of this thing called public education as opportunity, and everybody wants to reach everyone so that everybody has the opportunity, everything that has been said tonight, again, looks at achievement, resources, and not being educated on an island, the issue of desegregating, integrating, and breaking down our boundaries. While it hasn't been sufficient probably to satisfy anybody, there are many things that have happened in the last 5 years that say that we are focusing on achievement more than ever before, that we're attempting to equalize resources, and we're trying to break down those boundary lines, but as Dr. Bruno said, without changing the school district lines, but by establishing magnet schools here in Hartford that bring students in. Choice programs that allow students a choice of going out and coming in.
It sounds like you're hearing something you like.
Yes, I do, because as a matter of fact, my son is in a charter school. My daughter is in a magnet school. Those were my choice. The programs are quality program. It's such an intellectual program. It developed my kids to get into the future of what he wants to be. My daughter is gone to Trinity, and she went to the classical magnet program within Hartford. So I have confidence that we do have good education in Hartford. It's just a matter of we need to have more accountability and teachers, stuff like that, need professional training. You can't just have teachers teaching all year around and not doing any professional development. They do need that to make them better at what they're doing.
Representative Staples, you heard the word accountability. That's a big word in education these days. What is the Connecticut legislature doing to make the school system more accountable?
Well, I think the legislature's done a lot in the last 5 or 6 years, and one of the big things we've done is we've gone a little away from the general ECS grant to more targeted.
What's an ECS grant?
Sorry, the general education grant from states to communities, where from the state to the community, where the community has wide discretion in how to allocate those funds. We're going more toward categorical grants, where the state is giving resources out for reading programs, for early childhood programs, to stack the library with books.
Why?
Because the state, I think, is taking, in the Sheff versus O'Neill case, another strain of that of that case was the state is ultimately responsible for ensuring a good quality education. And the state is saying if we provide resources to communities, we need to do it more with strings attached. We need to do it more saying, here are resources for a particular program that we know makes a difference. And I think that is beginning to make a real difference in some of our urban centers. These programs are targeted to the 14 or 16 largest, poorest districts in the state. And that's a big step, I think, in the last 5 or 6 years where the state is saying, we'll provide more resources, but it has to be for certain programs that we know work.
Mr. Gross, I know you might disagree with that. Can you give us a brief synopsis why?
Why what? I'm sorry.
Why do you feel that Representative Staples says they are doing a lot for accountability, and you say the whole system doesn't work? You don't think so?
Absolutely not. We have national exams, NAEP exams, sponsored by the federal government. And the most recent one in history showed the following result. The majority of our high school seniors had never heard of the Great Society, the Marshall Plan, had never heard of the War of 1812, Patrick Henry, Tom Paine, and did not know the meaning of the Emancipation Proclamation. On an unmarked map of the world, they couldn't find Japan or Vietnam. The curriculum in Connecticut high schools is pitiful. For example, when I went to school, trigonometry was required. Physics was required. I went to junior high school, 52, the same school as Colin Powell. The black children in our school, about 20%, all read perfectly, 100% reading. The problem is that the curriculum is weak in American schools and in Connecticut schools. There's a patronizing, condescending attitude towards parents. The parents say, my child's on the honor roll, and they get A's and B's. They should be getting D's and F. A friend of mine in Western Connecticut, his daughter brought home an A in algebra. He sat down with her. She couldn't do a single algebraic equation correctly. He went to see the teacher. She said, we have a different view of assessment today. There's very little strong assessment. It's not tough love. It's patronizing and condescending
Maybe no love at all.
Steve, if I could just
Mr.
say something.
One point. Mr. Leibowitz, you're with boards of education. Do you think there is accountability, or do you think the state's cracking down, or not? Should they be?
Well, I think the state is taking a slightly wrong approach in basing most of their assessment on a single test, the mastery tests or the CAPS test. I think that it's more important to look at, are the students improving? If you have a school...
Well, how do you tell that if you don't have a quantitative measure?
You don't take this year's 6th grade versus next year's 6th grade. You take this year's 6th grade versus 2 years ago's 4th grade when they took the test. And if there's a significant improvement, then you reward that school. You don't reward the school like mine, whose students do well every year, and we were rewarded by the state. That money should be used for the New Havens and the Hartfords that show significant improvements, even though they're still below mastery. They're starting out low. That's the thing that most people aren't realizing. When you go into a city like Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, those students coming into the school are coming into their first educational experience. In the suburban schools, most of those kids have had 2 or 3 years of preschool and have a jump start. It's like getting a 50-yard head start in a 100-yard dash.
Mr. Sergi, what about that? How do you measure accountability?
I think I agree with Mr. Lenowitz a lot about the Connecticut Mastery Test and the CAP test, and we're trying to work in this next release and in the future years at looking at these cohorts of students. What we really want is everyone's son and daughter to read at a certain level in 4th grade and progress to a higher level in 6th and 8th grade. But don't make us choose between achievement and resources. It really is about both.
All right, Professor Leach, you're a professor of history at Trinity College. You have something historic you want to add?
Something historic, but also something current. I'm also the parent of 2 plaintiffs in Sheff versus O'Neill, and so you know my point of view. I feel that the quality of urban education in the state has been gravely shortchanged. I certainly believe, as against Mr. Cohen and perhaps others here, that in fact desegregation is one solution to that problem, not the only one certainly. Milo Sheff, the lead plaintiff in Sheff versus O'Neill, had 1 white classmate in 13 years of public education. That is a degree of segregation that is familiar only in Mississippi before the Brown versus Board of Education decision. That kind of isolation handicaps children. But even if you talk only about resources, I wanted to raise questions about how seriously Connecticut is devoting resources to improving urban education. I recall that when the idea arose of bringing the Patriots here as a way of saving Hartford, a $400 billion package was assembled within minutes to make that possible. If that amount of money were invested in a fund and only the interest were drawn at a modest 5% a year, that would afford $20 million a year to improve the schools
Very
of Hartford.
good. I have to warn everybody, we've got about 9 minutes left, so we need to make our answers short. Mr. Reynoso, you, I believe, are principal of the Bridge Academy. That is a charter school. How do you feel about competition and accountability?
Let me tell you, in our case, charter schools in our city, in Bridgeport in particular, it's progressing in putting every ounce of our energy for the school to work. It's not only to teach and help the community as far as teaching and help the kids, but also to help the families in Bridgeport. Competition, I don't think we are competing. I think we should share resources. One of our issues that we are facing right now is resources. Exactly, we are in need of resources to survive. The energy, the patience, the goodwill, the enthusiasm of our teachers, it's there. But we need resources to continue with
the
these
young
efforts.
lady next to you, Miss Weichsel, is that how you pronounce your last? She's an alumnus or alumna, or she goes to the school I went to, Bunnell High School, and I thought I had a pretty good experience there. Are you satisfied with your school? If there was one thing that you could improve after everything you've heard tonight, what do you think needs changing?
I really like the school a lot. I mean, I love it. I went to a different school freshman year, and I like it so much better, and I'm just having a great time. There's really nothing that I would change.
Do you have any view on some of the points that have been brought up tonight about how to improve schools, however?
I think that sometimes kids do need to be pushed a little bit more because kids find a way that they can slack off and they just go for that and they just slack off in every chance that they possibly can. And I think that that we do need a little bit more discipline. And I think that desegregation, I think that that kids sort of tend to segregate themselves more so based on, I mean, it just goes along with race, but I mean, that's more so based on style and interest. And no matter where you are, I mean, there are a lot of minority kids in my school, and they really just don't hang out with my friends, but it's not because we're racist or because we have anything against them. It's just because we have different interests, and I don't know if that can really ever be changed. Okay. Well, I mean, it could be changed eventually, but.
Thanks for your input. Representative Staples, can I ask you, going back to this issue of accountability, who needs to be cracked down on, if you will? Is it the teachers? Is it the administrators? Is it the Board of Education? Is it the taxpayers in that particular community who aren't contributing enough resources? If you're going to force accountability from the state on the local communities, who needs to have the whip cracked most on them, do you think?
Well, I think they all play a part, and I think the hard part for the state is trying to have an accountability system where you put some onus on the local districts and yet you let them have a role in deciding how they're going to dig themselves out from low-performing schools. And I think this last year we did pass legislation that is targeting schools at the lowest level of mastery test performance, but we asked those districts to develop the improvement plans over the next 2 years and implement those improvement plans designed to increase their test scores. So I think the state has to have a hand on requiring accountability, but if you don't engage the district at the local level in developing the solution, it's going to be very difficult to get them to actually produce results.
I think we really are at a crossroads, and we either continue to go the way of each town saying this is ours and that's yours, or we really, in our small state, which is workable, can work and bring these walls down. And I think the state ought to lead the way by being itself accountable for what the Constitution requires of it with regard to funding and with regard to a court case that places the burden clearly on the state, the commissioner, the State Department of Education, and the legislature to desegregate and integrate our schools.
Mr. Gross, briefly. Let's assume that money is important in education. Michigan solved the problem very simply. They eliminated property tax as the base for public education, and they put in a sales tax to cover all public education in the state of Michigan. And over a period of years, this happened 2 years ago, over a period of years, they're going to try to equalize the amount of money per child. Now, that's one solution in terms of money. But is money that important? The Catholic schools spend 30% less than the public schools. The Protestant schools spend 40% less. I spoke to the head of the Protestant school organization. They're 2 years ahead of the public school children.
We've got to move on. Representative Staples, quickly to you. Do you think, going to what Mr. Bruno said before about regionalism, that your legislature, your suburban-dominated legislature, would ever make the move toward a regional plan? Or is that too hard politically to achieve?
I think Mr. Bruno misses the point on Sheff versus O'Neill, and I think the legislature did respond to the court case. But the legislature said that in addition to promoting free interchange across school district lines, we had to improve the quality of education to make that desegregation actually occur. You can't attract kids into the Hartford school system unless you improve the Hartford school system. So the legislature took another step to take over the Hartford school system, put resources into it, and I think that's the approach. It was a balanced approach where if you don't bring the low-performing districts to a higher level, you're not going to integrate the communities and ultimately the school systems. So that had to be an even-handed approach, and just regionalism misses that point. You have to actually have an improvement in quality, or the regionalism won't make any more difference.
Mr. Sergi, you said in the documentary you didn't want, you would agree with someone who said money is the answer, and you would also agree with somebody who said money is not the only answer. Explain that a little.
Well, I think for all the reasons you've heard probably over this show, you find that you can't just manufacture student achievement with money. You need a teacher who cares, you need a student who's motivated, you need a family who wants the student to achieve, and you need government to play its part. You asked about accountability before. Accountability and responsibility are words we want all our young people to demonstrate in their lifetimes. And whenever you point to the other person about being more accountable and responsible, you're generally wrong. It's about each of us having a role.
Mr. Edwards, you're a frontline guy, you're a high school principal. Do you think that, are you optimistic about what the future is going to bring, or do you think schools are going to keep plodding along the way they have been?
No, I'm very optimistic.
Why?
I think that...
Based on everything you've heard tonight, why?
Well, because if I'm not optimistic, what do I say to our kids? I have two students here, and what future do I hold for them if I'm not optimistic? I believe that we have the opportunity, the knowledge base, we have people who care, and we can make a difference. Mr. Gross has mentioned several times about the scholars. He wants to see an education. You need to know, Mr. Gross, that we do have an alternative route program, so any of your scholars from Yale, Harvard, anywhere else can enter that program, and in 6 weeks in the summer, get in front of a class.
That's 150 teachers in the entire state. It's a ploy. Now, the state of New Jersey has a real program. 30% of all the new teachers this year are alternate certification, and in peer review, they were voted by the regular certified teachers to be superior to them because they come from better colleges with better grades. They were stockbrokers or anything else, changed careers. California and Texas have done the same, and I spoke to the heads of both programs. They say the alternate teachers who have never spent one day in a school of ed are superior to the so-called trained teachers.
We've done 150 a year for 10 years, and we hope to do more. We agree with Mr. Gross to a certain extent.
All right, very good. Well, that's going to have to do it for tonight, but these discussions and debates certainly will go on. I want to thank our panel and studio audience for their contributions. And thank you for joining us this evening as we explored not only the history of education, but where we stand today and a framework for future success in education here in Connecticut.